What if, instead of the portal gun, you had the ability to resize props arbitrarily? That sounds really cool on paper, if only this weren't a game about portals. You see, to make this work, I've had to completely redesign the single-player campaign. In some cases, adjusting the existing puzzles was good enough, but for others, I've had to invent entirely new puzzles on top. In fact, if you exit out to the title screen, it no longer reads Portal 2. I've practically made an entirely new puzzle game. Not a sequel to Portal 2. It doesn't provide any new story and ultimately still takes place in the same chambers, but there's enough new content that it might as well be its own spin-off in an alternate timeline. There's this infamous anecdote that Valve was initially planning for the sequel to Portal to not contain any portals. They had come up with what they called the f-stop mechanic, and similar ideas do exist in some successful puzzle games today. Everyone working on it was reportedly excited about the idea, but playtesters were confused about the lack of portals. Now, at a glance, it seems obvious that making a Portal game without the titular mechanic isn't a great idea. What were Valve smoking? But believe me, I have to regularly remind people that you can't remove the teleportation from Portal. Being in the position that I'm in, I receive suggestions for mod ideas nearly daily. I reject almost every single one of them, and there are several reasons why. One of which is that people assume you can just replace portals with some other mechanic and call it a day. This is a video about the mod I made, I promise, but I first want to address the question of why. Why did I make this against my own intuition? Well, the short answer is that I was commissioned to. In case you didn't know, you can pay me to make Portal 2 mods, and that's exactly what happened here. If you see someone with this username, you can thank them for their contributions to science. I would not have done this if someone hadn't paid me to. But the longer answer to the why question is that I simply got very invested. There's no reason to put in as much effort as I did. I wasn't paid that much, but I guess there's some part of me that just wanted to make a new campaign again, kinda like what I did with Reverse Mod over 3 years ago. Think of this video as both a showcase and a developer commentary. If you want to experience the mod for yourself first, the link will be in the description. They often tell you to build your first level last, and that's for good reason. I was initially just going to make sure all the maps are beatable, and the earlier levels already ticked that box from just being this simple. But later, when I got more attached to the game I was making, I came back and moved the buttons in these chambers to the walls, with little instructor hints teaching you how to use the resizing mechanic. Speaking of, how does the resizing mechanic even work? I mean, there's nothing in Portal 2 that behaves this way, so how is this effect achieved? You might think, surely there's some property for overriding the scale of things, and you'd be almost right. The model scale property of almost any object does exactly that. It scales the size of the model, but only visually. The collision of the object is baked in and doesn't change at all. You could try to create an invisible box around the original prop, but you quickly run into a few issues. Firstly, this only works when scaling up, not down. Secondly, you don't actually keep the exact shape and physics properties of the original prop. And thirdly, this introduces obvious problems when colliding with buttons or lasers. There is another property that can resize things, one that works much better than this. Every model in the source engine has a QC file describing its properties and how they relate to the object it's tied to. And there is a QC command called scale, which does exactly what you expect it to do, with the only caveat being that it's baked into the model file. You can't change QC properties during runtime. They're used for compiling the model, which makes things much faster in-game, but also means that the model's vertices have no concept of things like scale. What you can change during runtime is the model itself. So, of course, put 2 and 2 together, and now we've got just over 30 different models for each type of cube, with every next one being a different increment of 0.1 times the model scale. Still, as you can imagine, the source engine isn't exactly built to handle hot swapping models like this. If I were to now call the set model method on a cube to change its size, the game would crash. This is because models have to be pre-cached before they're used in the engine. So, okay, say we first pre-cache the model and then call set model on the cube. It looks like it worked, but in reality, we're back to square one. The model is visually bigger, but the collisions are exactly the same. It seems like the only way to draw out a model's physics properties is to create a new prop altogether. But even then, there are some limitations to what you can do dynamically. See, VScript modding in Portal 2 is a bit of a mess. I wrote a library that streamlines most of it, but there are still some things you simply can't do. For example, dynamically created entities will always spawn with default parameters. You can change these parameters, but as we've already found out, changing the model of a prop after it's been created doesn't do what we want it to do. The simplest solution is to have the props be already present in every level, and then use an entity like point template to create copies of it. But I really didn't want to copy every single Portal 2 map for this mod just to add a few entities. There had to be a better solution. Introducing the commentary script. These inconspicuous text files are typically used for developer commentary notes in many Valve games. But if you take a closer look, these are literally just entity definitions. You can shove any arbitrary entity here, put the game into developer commentary mode, and suddenly you've created fully qualified map entities dynamically. In fact, some Left 4 Dead 2 maps use these to create player blockers, simply because it's easier than recompiling the map. The point is, we can use these to create properly pre-cached and fully physics-simulated clones of cubes with custom models. So every time you resize a cube in this mod, it is replaced with a slightly bigger or smaller copy. This, of course, causes a few issues on its own, like how if a resized cube is fizzled, it needs to then relay that information to the original cube so that the cube dropper knows to drop a new one, but that can all be worked around with scripting. Also, with this implementation, if you're standing on top of a cube while scaling it up, it'll clip into the player and briefly get them stuck. So to prevent that, I run find closest passable space whenever the intersection happens to clip the player out right away. Okay, now that that's done, we can get back to the puzzles. Now, there are some maps with only minor changes, and some that don't change at all, but I won't bore you with those. Instead, let's just go through the interesting ones. Smooth Jazz attempts to teach the player that making cubes bigger lets you reach them more easily, and the second room does the same thing, though there are a few viable solutions here. Future Starter is actually the only map I decompiled for editing, and that was only to remove an invisible wall from this cage so that you could scale the cube down to take it out. I just thought it was a cool solution, that's all. The rest of the map changes are done entirely with scripting. When you enter the second room, the cube conveniently rolls right to the edge of this platform, making it possible to reach when scaled up. This is done in a few places throughout the mod, with a pusher entity that guides the cube to where it has to go. And the rest of this chapter mostly consists of cutscenes, and the only map modifications here are pre-placed portals. In some maps, like the Incinerator, the player is also given a cube with which to platform across the chamber. The same happens in Laser Intro, except this time the cube conveniently drops out of the ceiling while the chamber is shaking. Initially, the solution I had in mind was just climbing up to the exit, as the door in this level isn't actually connected to anything. But after seeing this solution from a pay-to-win member, I've changed my mind, and this is now the official solution. On laser stairs, the cube is once again rigged to roll towards the player, though this time it's a little more obvious because the dropper is much lower down and the cube isn't really falling that fast to begin with. Dual Lasers has a pretty interesting solution. You're given 2 laser cubes, one of which you can use to reach the other, and once you're up there, you can flip the cube upside down and scale it up so that it reaches the laser. Then, everything up until Trustfling doesn't have any significant modifications, and while it might seem like Trustfling itself just has a few pre-placed portals and a light bridge, there's actually one more change here that's a lot more subtle. You see, the first time you press this button, the cube dropper dispenses a bunch of garbage. Typically, that garbage contains an edgeless safety cube. This is the only time this thing appears in the entire single-player campaign. I really didn't want to create 30 copies of its model just to make it scalable in this one occasion, but I also suspected that players would likely try to resize it and get upset once they realize you can't. So, the solution? Just remove it. You can't be upset about something that's not even there. Next up, there's Pit Flings, better known as the Companion Cube puzzle. Instead of using portals to unblock the laser, you can just scale down the cube so that it doesn't reach the laser. And after you've done that, 2 new portals open up to let you fling to the exit. In Fizzler Intro, we once again see one of those glass panels with a hole in it, Now, I could have spent 5 minutes recompiling the map to remove the invisible blocker here, but I'm lazy and I'm a software developer, so instead I spent 15 minutes making a script that detects when the cube is small enough and teleports it to the other side. Ceiling Catapult is unremarkable for the most part, but I did move the laser receptor a bit to the left, which just so happens to be in front of this pile of junk, forcing you to resize the cube to bring the laser over. Ricochet requires a bit of a tricky maneuver where you jump from on top of the cube and grab it midair, but it's easier than it sounds. On Bridge the Gap, there's a slightly slanted panel projecting a light bridge down to the exit, but this one actually covers the button, marking one of the few times in this mod where you have to scale down a cube to put it on a button. The start of turret intro is currently unchanged, and due to some technical limitations you can't resize turrets, which might make it somewhat difficult for casual players. You have to bait out the turrets to give you time to take cover and approach. But, of course, once you gain access to a cube, those problems go away. Then, a couple maps later, you're presented with two ways of clearing this turret nest. One solution is to use the least portals route by taking a turret from the first room and using it to climb up the ledge. Or you can just scale up the cube to topple over the turrets. Pull the Rug has possibly one of my favorite puzzles in this mod. The button is raised slightly above the floor and the bridge has been removed. You can put the cube on the button, which opens the exit door, and then scale it up to block the laser, which lowers the platform. Then, once you get on it, you can scale the cube back down slightly to unblock the laser and move the platform back up. It's a really simple solution, but I just like how well it translates from the original puzzle. Column blocker is a bit unintuitive, admittedly. There are a couple ways to solve this, but the easiest is to tap the button and walk out of the portal at just the right time to catch the cube. The timing isn't super tight, but it might take a few attempts to get it down. Now, laser chaining is probably the most difficult chamber in the mod, both in regards to the puzzle and its execution. First, you get a cube and scale it to climb this bridge, where you'll find the usual pack of turrets along with another cube. Then you have to figure out a way to stack these to get up to the third cube. What I found works best is scaling up one of them first, then scaling the other one while standing on it, and finally picking up that first cube to scale it down, stand on it, and scale it up again. And once you have the third cube, it's time to use it to climb up all the way to the laser. This requires the full scale of all 3 cubes, so the juggling gets a little bit more complicated here. But once you do figure that out, the rest is pretty straightforward. You'll line up the first cube, then go over to the faith plate, use one of your other 2 cubes to reach it, fling over to the laser relay using the pre-placed portals, and line up the last laser. And from here, it's a matter of taking the last remaining cube and climbing onto the bridge, just like at the beginning of the map. For triple laser, I just gave the player a bunch of cubes. The alternative was to just pre-place a couple of portals, but I thought that'd be way too boring for a chamber as iconic as this. During the escape sequence, there's not really much to write home about. Most of everything is handled through more pre-placed portals. There is one part that's a bit different, and that's this turret ambush, where you have to quickly resize a cube to knock over the turret. This part is actually also rigged, as for whatever reason, the turret doesn't normally want to topple over. So I used another pusher to ensure the cube goes where I want it to go. Fast forward to the level adequately titled Cave Johnson, and we've got another stack of cubes for getting to this balcony. Once you ride up the elevator, you'll notice a couple of pre-placed portals setting up the fling. Though, once you actually fling through, a scripted momentum trigger redirects your fling slightly off course, conveniently landing you on the catwalk next to the elevator. And, as it turns out, because of all these skips, you don't actually get to hear Cave Johnson speak in the map that's named after him. The second puzzle in Repulsion Intro would have been very unintuitive without any portals, so I made the flip panels automatically open the orange portal when activated. Bomb Flings has an interesting composition. The light bridge has made its way back to the 50s, giving you just enough room to scale up another cube for the fling through the pre-placed portals. But the following level, Crazy Box, is one of my personal favorites. You start by just scaling the sledge with a cube, which is nothing new, but then you have to bring that cube with you into the next room, where it's useful for getting the height required to make this fling. This one is also admittedly a bit cheated. Your vertical velocity is multiplied by a constant every time you go through this floor portal, as otherwise you couldn't reach the repulsion gel on the wall. After this section, you get another convenient cube out in the open, with an accompanying ceiling portal this time. This is for a mechanic I desperately wanted to find a use for. You scale up the cube to reach up into the ceiling portal, and then in the last room you'd normally cover the cube in repulsion gel, hence the name Crazy Box. But since there are no portals here for that, you can instead scale up the cube to have it shatter all the glass from the inside. And finally, here comes yet another mechanic that I'm really glad I got to use. If you scale up the cube and put its corner on the button, then once you get on the elevator, you can scale it back down, which effectively moves it off of the button, making the elevator go back up. I hope you can see why I really like this map. For the start of propulsion flings, I did have to cheat a bit again to make the repulsion gel slightly bouncier than usual, just so that you can make it over to the runway without assistance. But I'd say the other part of this puzzle sort of makes up for that. You see, outside of that one bridge covering the button, there aren't many scenarios where you have to scale a cube down to fit it onto a button. So, to make up for that, this cube is on a pair of planks with a narrow gap in between, forcing you to scale it down from a distance to flip the panel. Now, I really wasn't looking forward to modding Conversion Intro. The final two chambers of this chapter are super vertical, which sort of becomes a problem when you don't have portals, but as with most things, the more time you spend on it, the more you start to care. So this part actually has another one of my favorite mechanics. Once you get to the pump control room, you're expected to have brought a cube with you, and this is so that you can block the large pistons from crushing you. Now, I'll admit this isn't the most intuitive mechanic. I really would have liked to have the opportunity to teach the player this trick before they have to use it in practice, but I'm just working with what I've got, not making an entirely new campaign. And of course, 3 Gels is another very vertical map, and for this one, I didn't even bother. I used a world portal to connect the entrance directly to the exit. Chapters 8 and 9 are iconic for, well, various things, but perhaps most importantly to us, the Frankenturret. These look mostly like regular cubes, just with legs, and they definitely function like regular cubes, at least in respect to buttons, so you'd obviously expect them to scale the same way. But alas, it's not that simple. You've probably already noticed that pretty much the only thing you can scale are cubes. Yes, part of that is because scaling any given model requires making 30 copies of it, but I also wouldn't be opposed to doing that for recurring game elements like security cameras and turrets. And I think it'd be pretty funny to resize Wheatley, but most entities don't allow you to choose a model the way cubes do. At least not as seamlessly, which again shouldn't be a problem with the Frankenturrets, but even though they swim like a cube and quack like a cube, they're not the same entity as a cube, or a turret for that matter. Frankenturrets have their own very limited entity class. At first, I was just going to replace all Frankenturrets with storage cubes and call it a day, but then I realized that that's not too far from an actual implementation. Say we make each Frankenturret non-solid and hide an invisible regular cube under it. We can already scale the regular cube, so all that's left is making it look like the Frankenturret is being scaled too. And for this, we can use that model scale property I mentioned earlier. It wasn't viable back then because it doesn't scale the collision mesh, but here we already have collision from the invisible cube. So, back to the maps then. For most of these, I've again had to add a couple of stationary portals and not much else, but on this map with a ceiling mounted button, I also added a panel that's just high enough to allow a fully scaled up cube reach the button. And on this map with a wall mounted button, scaling the cube up lets you more easily put it in the funnel, which pushes it against that button. Some of you, me included, have probably been waiting for a chamber where the solution is to make a cube big enough to bridge the gap between 2 buttons. It seems obvious for a mod like this. Well, you see, there's only one place in the game where 2 floor buttons are next to each other. But even here, they're way too far apart for a single cube to reasonably press down both. So, you can probably imagine that once I saw the opportunity to make a puzzle that allows this to happen, I took it. The 2 buttons here control the polarity of the funnel and the position of the blue portal. Alternating between the buttons is enough for getting the cube, but to reach the exit, you have to press down both of them. I'm pretty proud of this one actually. It feels like the puzzle was designed for the mod and not adapted from an existing one. The next map is also pretty heavily modified, though perhaps not with as intuitive of a solution. First, you fling to the laser cube. That part is fairly straightforward, but then you have to use it to reach the Frankenturret, which you'll find is just barely within reach. But once you do get it, as I'm sure you'll have figured out by now, the 2 of these can be used to climb up to the exit. Continuing the trend of whole new puzzles layered on top of campaign maps is Laser Platform. Part 1 of the solution is to drop the cube on the platform and scale it down so that it passes under the light bridge on its way back. Then you scale it back up again so that it can reach the laser and stop the platform. This will also create a light bridge to let you get up to the platform from where you can line up the laser into the receptacle for the exit door. The next 2 maps aren't very remarkable, and frankly neither is the rest of the finale sequence. Most of these levels are incredibly scripted and end up being managed solely through pre-placed portals. There is this one part where you're given a Frankenturret with which to get into a funnel, after which you're expected to bring it with you to tap a button on the wall, then block the line of sight of a few turrets, then tap another button, this time on the ceiling. You can then bring it into the next map for one final climb up to this portal, after which a fizzler prevents you from bringing it any further. And for the final boss fight, I'm sorry, this one's gonna be anticlimactic, because there really isn't anything to resize, and it's not like it would help at all if you could, so this too is handled through more pre-placed portals that cycle between predetermined locations depending on the phase of the boss fight. Alright, Post-Mortem. What have we learned? Well, first of all, you still aren't subscribed. We've gone through an entire video and more than 80% of you haven't even considered clicking a free button. It's free and it helps a lot, so do it. Do it now. Secondly, if you want to commission a mod for yourself, you totally can. The link is in the description, and I'll appreciate your support. Though do note that if you want something of this scale, it won't be as cheap. The development of this mod made me significantly rework my commission pricing, but 9 out of 10 times it's still biased against me, so all in all you're getting a pretty darn good deal. And thirdly, there are quite a few puzzles in this mod that I'm not entirely satisfied with. I'm sure that if I'd spent more time on it, this wouldn't be a problem, but I've got other things to do, and I'd already put in way too much effort into this project. There are a few cool mechanics that I never really got to use, like having a scaled up cube on top of a portal, then scaling it down from a distance so that it falls through the portal onto a button. It's just really hard to find opportunities to integrate specific tricks like these into existing campaign maps, let alone balance the gameplay. So when you play through this mod for yourself, it's very likely that some parts will feel repetitive, while others will stump you with a super unintuitive solution. Unless I build a custom campaign, I don't really get the luxury of teaching the player specific mechanics, or portioning those mechanics in a way that doesn't bore the player. But again, I'll leave that up to the map designers, as that's way outside of the scope of this little project. Anyway, if you do want to play this mod for yourself, the link will be in the description. Otherwise, I'll see you around. Have a good one.